So I talked a little about this in yesterday's blog post. Did anybody read yesterday's blog post? All right, well, you guys can take a break then. So the Frankencourse. I had somebody, I should probably ask again, did anybody send me? I had somebody send me a course once, and she'd been reading the blog for a while, and she finally got some software, so she's really excited. And she emailed me, said, "Tom, I built my first course, all excited." She wanted to show me, and she said, "I've been reading your blog for years, and I've used every tip that you've ever shared." And sure enough, the blog, or her course, did have about every tip I shared. So I joked with her. I said it was less an e-learning course and more like the Rapid E-Learning Blog Museum. Right? She just needed to put little date labels on it. This is the link to this post that I used this effect. And and she got it. I didn't want to hurt her feelings or anything. But the thing is, we call those things like the Frankencourse. You think of Frankenstein, right? He looked like a person, but he was just a bunch of people. He was like all your neighbors stitched together, right? But I mean, it's like an arm here, leg there, head, right? He wasn't a real person. He was a cobbled together person. And a lot of times, these e-learning courses that we create have that cobbled together look. Especially when you're doing kind of the hybrid development where you're doing some free form, some form-based stuff. If you're using the Articulate suite, you've got each application is its own standalone application, so it's got its own structure. And then you're basically using PowerPoint to bring those things in there, but then you're bringing in the other application's features, so the player structure and those things. So if you use that default structure, you're going to get this look that looks like pieces pulled together rather than one cohesive course. And then you throw in these other things, right? So you've got the fonts. I always tell people, try to limit yourself to about 9 fonts. No. But you've seen those courses, right? And you might have built those. If it's a curly font, don't use it. It's a good general rule on fonts. You might not be a type expert, but curly fonts probably aren't good. Unless you're using screen beans and something else. No. But you kind of get all these weird fonts in there. And a lot of times people are working on a course and they think, "Oh, this content's so boring. If only I could have a curly font in here." Then, the curly font combined with the screen bean that I added a tie, because I learned how to ungroup clip art, so I put a tie on the screen bean. And our company logo, right? The screen bean guy's holding a sign with the company logo. Now I've got the curly font. Now the course is really engaging, right? And then you go to the next slide and say, that curly font's so old. I'm going to go to a new font now, right? So you find a new font, you have a new color scheme. I mean, that's how people a lot of times are working, right? You go from one slide to the next, you start making design decisions because this just looks old, because you've been working on that one slide for like 2 days. So it's old news, right? You just saw a new graphic the next day, and you think, I'm going to apply that to the next slide I do. So you get this look where it's just not quite together. It's this discordant look. You different images, there's some clip art. It's not the same style of clip art. So you've got one style of clip art and another style of clip art. Then you go to a photo. Then you found out how to do photo effects. So you apply some cool, you put this like watercolor effect on the photos. And the person who's going through the course was like, why is the person all smudgy? They were good looking on the previous slide, but they're all smudgy. And there's all these curly fonts on the screen. So I'll give you some ideas on how to get rid of that cobbled together look. So the first thing is, it doesn't matter what content you have, start with a blank screen. Be intentional with the design that you have, right? You don't want to just go with what you have. A lot of times, and this is the case if you're working with PowerPoint, you've got content that maybe you created or subject matter expert created. So you've got, say, good content, and there's a look to it already. Somebody's already put images in there, and they've got a font, they've used a template or whatever it is. And then you start working from that. And what happens is that, whether it could be good, but it doesn't matter at this point, But you start working with what they have rather than being intentional about what you're designing. So what you really need to do is say, okay, this is all I have. Let me step away from it. I've got a blank screen. I'm going to sketch out what I want, and then I'm going to start pulling the things together based on what I intended to be rather than letting what I have guide it. I always tell that story. When we bought our house a few years ago, there was a rhododendron, which is, I'm up in Washington area, so there's a lot. Those are all over the place. And so we had this big rhodie that, I don't know, our neighbor told us that the guy who used to own the house was like a pilot in World War II and brought this thing back from China and all this stuff. But it was in the middle of our yard. So then we started like designing things in our yard around this stupid tree, right? And then I hated mowing because the way it was laid out on there, I just want straight lines, make the mowing as easy as possible. But then my kids were climbing on there and making a mess. There's always something, there's holes because they're always digging around the tree and all. But this tree that we didn't plant, and it was a nice tree, but it dictated all of our design ideas for our yard. Although my wife would say there really are no ideas in the yard. But the thing is, that tree, and it was there, and so we started working around it, and what we really should have done was just leveled it, although our neighbor would have been upset. Fortunately, we didn't have to make that decision because I had 2 young kids, so they broke enough of it to where we were able to get rid of it. But the thing was, that tree was there, and then because it was there, we started making decisions not based on what we wanted, but based on what was there. And a lot of times we do that with the e-learning courses. We get content from our subject matter experts, and we just start running with what exists rather than stepping back and saying, I've got this blank screen, I need to build a course, what content needs to be in there, what's the right look for the course, how am I going to build my interactivity. So you got to step back and be intentional about everything that you do. And it might be that the content that you get from the subject matter expert, the content that already exists, is perfect, but make that decision in an intentional way rather than just running with what you have. And we'll talk more about that in that second leg when David goes through. We've got a neat activity to kind of walk through some of the visual design. But be intentional. Come up with some simple style guides. I like to call it style guidance rather than style guides, because as soon as you say style guides, somebody walks away and says, this is perfect, and then there's a rule that everything has to be exactly the same way. And the style guide is really, I like to think of them as more course level style guides. So I'm building a course, I want to be intentional, I'm looking at the course, I'm going to figure out what fonts I need to use. I'm going to figure out how I use the fonts, what colors I'm using, when I use the colors. If I'm using clip art, if that's all I have access to, what clip art am I going to use? How am I going to treat the clip art? You can ungroup it. A tip I always recommend to people: if you have to use clip art, find a style of clip art and then use the exact same style in all of the throughout the course. And then you can ungroup it, which is, we've got all the tips and tricks in that page, but you can ungroup it and clean it up and make the clip art look more like you want it to look rather than the way it looks. So a lot of things you can do. If you're going to use photos, figure out how you're going to use the photos. You go to iStock and you buy photos. There's one person looks one way, and then you buy another photo. It's a different type of styling on the photo, and they just don't look right. So you got to figure out how you want everything to be. But the key in there is come up with a style guide. We'll look at a few basic things, and then David will touch on more of that when he goes through the design mapping ideas. But come up with a style guide specific to your course that kind of guides the decisions you make. As we go backwards, you want to be intentional, so you're beginning to make the decisions, and then you're going to figure that out. And then again, warning, don't become the style guide fascist. One thing on style guides, which I think is a good tip, it's one I've used in the past. How many people have to deal with all the branding issues at work, right? So the company says you've got to have, and nobody knows where they work, right? So you've got to have logos everywhere, right? Like everybody's working for NASCAR or something, right? You should tell your company, we can rent out, we've got enough room here for a few more logos. Let's rent out some space for the course. We've got its captive audience. So a couple of ideas. One is when you're working with, if you're working with the PowerPoint to Flash tool, don't let the subject matter experts know that you're working with PowerPoint. As far as they're concerned, you're producing an e-learning course. It doesn't matter what technology you're using. So if you don't let them know you're using PowerPoint, that eliminates a lot of that whole PowerPoint branding nonsense, right? Anyway, don't let them know you have PowerPoint, right, that you're working in PowerPoint. And then if you have to do the branding, the PowerPoint to Flash tools, work your branding into the player structure rather than the screen. You know, if you're working in Flash, I found, you know, my experience, when I'm working in Flash, I don't have all those branding requirements with the logos the same way I do when they know I was working with the PowerPoint to Flash tool. So don't let the person know, or your company, or whoever you're working with, they don't necessarily need to know that you're taking the PowerPoint files or working in PowerPoint, converting that to Flash. So that'll get rid of a lot of the PowerPoint branding requirements.